Picture yourself as the head of a major European industrial conglomerate. Your company produces automobiles, heavy machinery, or advanced electronics, the kind of products that define industrial prowess. You're operating in Germany, Europe's manufacturing powerhouse, a nation synonymous with engineering excellence and economic dominance. But something has gone terribly wrong. It's 2024, and you're staring at an electricity bill that's tripled in 5 years. Your production lines are running at half capacity, not because demand has collapsed, not because of supply chain issues, but because keeping your factory operational is bleeding you dry. This is the reality of the Energiewende, Germany's grand energy transformation. The country poured over $500 billion into what was supposed to be the future of clean energy. Instead, they engineered an economic catastrophe that's dismantling Europe's industrial core piece by piece. They now have electricity costs that make manufacturing unsustainable, a grid that runs on the very fossil fuels they tried to eliminate, and the most absurd twist of all, they're literally demolishing wind turbines to dig up more coal. This is the story of how good intentions, political calculation, and catastrophic planning created the most expensive self-inflicted wound in modern economic history. Let's break down exactly how one of the world's smartest nations walked straight into a trap of its own design. To understand this disaster, we need to rewind to early 2011. Germany was in an enviable position. Their energy mix was balanced and reliable, nuclear providing roughly a quarter of their electricity, supplemented by coal, natural gas, and a growing renewable sector. Chancellor Angela Merkel, who held a doctorate in quantum chemistry, had just extended the operational licenses for the country's nuclear fleet. The strategy made sense. Use nuclear as stable, zero-carbon baseload power while gradually scaling up wind and solar over the coming decades. Then March 11th happened. The Earth moved in Japan. A massive earthquake triggered a tsunami that devastated the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear facility. It was absolutely a catastrophe for Japan, but it occurred 5,000 miles from Germany in an earthquake zone, at a plant built in the 1970s. Germany doesn't sit on tectonic fault lines. It doesn't face tsunami threats. A rational response would have involved safety audits and perhaps some design upgrades. But politics runs on emotion, not spreadsheets. The German public, already primed by decades of anti-nuclear activism from Die Grünen, the Green Party, erupted in fear. Street protests multiplied. The anti-nuclear movement, which had been fighting since Chernobyl in the 1980s, saw their vindication moment. Merkel faced a choice: stand on principle and scientific reasoning or make a political move to preserve her coalition government. She chose politics. Within days of Fukushima, Merkel announced the Atomausstieg, the complete nuclear exit. All 17 nuclear plants would shut down by 2022. 8 were deactivated immediately, flipped off like light switches. This single decision is where everything started unraveling. Here's an analogy that captures the insanity. Imagine you own a home heated by a dependable furnace. You decide to install solar panels, excellent idea. But instead of installing the panels first and then gradually phasing out the furnace, you take a sledgehammer to the furnace in January and say, "The sun will provide." That's essentially what Germany did. They destroyed 17 fully functional, debt-free, zero-carbon power plants, and then scrambled to replace that capacity with intermittent sources. Why does this matter so much? Because building renewable infrastructure is expensive, yes, but building it to replace perfectly good nuclear plants is economic insanity. You're not expanding your energy supply. You're spending astronomical sums just to maintain what you already had. From 2010 to 2020, Germany dumped massive subsidies into the EEG, the Renewable Energy Sources Act. Every German household and business paid surcharges on their electricity to fund this transformation. Power prices shot up to nearly 3 times what Americans pay. And here's the truly bitter irony. Despite those hundreds of billions spent, Germany's carbon emissions barely budged for an entire decade. Why? Because when the wind stopped blowing and the sun stopped shining, which happens constantly in Northern Europe, they couldn't flip the nuclear plants back on. So they burned lignite, the filthiest form of coal imaginable. They obliterated their cleanest energy source in the name of environmentalism, and ended up belching more carbon from the dirtiest fuel on Earth. So you've eliminated your nuclear capacity. You're building wind and solar like crazy, but they're unreliable. You need something to cover those gaps. Those cold, dark, windless stretches the Germans call Dunkelflaute. If you're serious about eventually moving away from coal, what's your bridge fuel? Natural gas. It's cleaner than coal, plants can ramp up quickly, and it's essential for industrial processes like chemical production and steel making. But Germany has virtually no natural gas reserves of its own, so where do you get it? Enter Vladimir Putin. For decades, Germany pursued a policy called Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. The philosophy was almost touchingly naive. If we integrate our economy with Russia's, if we become their biggest customer for natural gas, they'll gradually transform into a peaceful, democratic society. We'll be too economically intertwined for conflict. This thinking led to Nord Stream 1 and the planned Nord Stream 2, massive pipelines running beneath the Baltic Sea, designed to pump Siberian gas straight into German industry. It wasn't just a dependency, it was a structural vulnerability. By 2021, Germany was sourcing more than half of its natural gas from a single external supplier. Entire industries, BASF, Bayer, Volkswagen, and countless mid-sized manufacturers, were built around one critical assumption: that this energy supply would remain cheap, stable, and uninterrupted. Warnings were everywhere. Neighboring European countries repeatedly cautioned that relying so heavily on one source created serious strategic risk. Energy analysts, economists, and policymakers raised concerns that Germany was placing its industrial future into very fragile hands. Yet those warnings were dismissed. There was even a widely remembered moment in 2018 at an international forum when the idea that Germany could face energy risk was openly brushed aside by officials, treated as unrealistic or exaggerated. Then reality intervened. In early 2022, global energy markets were suddenly disrupted. Gas flows became unpredictable, prices surged, and long-standing assumptions collapsed almost overnight. Supply routes that had been considered permanent were no longer reliable, exposing just how exposed Germany's energy system had become. Natural gas prices didn't rise gradually. They spiked dramatically. At their peak, market prices increased by more than 10 times. For large manufacturers, this was devastating. A factory that once paid €1 million per month for energy was suddenly facing bills closer to 10 million. No business model can absorb that kind of shock. The government was forced into emergency action. Tens of billions were spent stabilizing major utilities to prevent system failure. Hundreds of billions more were allocated to shield households and businesses from energy costs that threatened social stability. And here's where the trap fully closed. Germany had already shut down nuclear power. It had committed politically to moving away from coal. And the energy source it depended on most was no longer dependable. The response became increasingly desperate. Officials traveled worldwide seeking alternative energy supplies, including liquefied natural gas. But LNG is far more expensive than pipeline gas, requiring complex processing, shipping, and infrastructure. The era of cheap German energy was over. For decades, Germany's global competitiveness rested on a quiet advantage: affordable, reliable energy feeding world-class engineering. Once that advantage disappeared, the foundation of Made in Germany began to crack. If you want to see the true cost of this energy disaster, look at Ludwigshafen. This city is home to BASF, the world's largest chemical producer. Their facility there consumes as much natural gas annually as the entire nation of Switzerland. For decades, this was the industrial heart of Germany, converting cheap Russian gas into fertilizers, plastics, pharmaceuticals, and countless other products the world depends on. In 2023, that heart started failing. BASF announced permanent European downsizing. They're cutting 2,600 jobs at Ludwigshafen. They've shut down ammonia production. And where is that investment going? China. BASF is constructing a $10 billion cutting-edge complex in Zhanjiang. Why? Because in China, energy is affordable and the government isn't waging a moral crusade against industrial production. They're not alone in this exodus. Miele, maker of premium appliances, is shifting production to Poland. Volkswagen is openly considering building its next-generation battery plants in Canada and the United States, chasing the massive subsidies from America's Inflation Reduction Act. Economists use the sanitized term structural adjustment. I prefer the honest term, deindustrialization. This matters because Germany is fundamentally an export economy. They don't have Silicon Valley tech giants. They make physical things: cars, machines, chemicals. If you destroy the ability to manufacture competitively, what remains? Tourism and nostalgia. Martin Brudermüller, BASF's CEO, stated it plainly. Europe is becoming increasingly uncompetitive. That's corporate speak for, we're leaving before this ship sinks completely. This isn't just about corporate profits or shareholder returns. This is about the high-paying, unionized, middle-class jobs that form the backbone of a stable society. When steel mills close, they don't reopen. When chemical plants relocate to Asia, they don't come back. Germany is systematically hollowing out its industrial base to meet carbon reduction targets that the rest of the world is largely ignoring. It's like burning down your own house to demonstrate how seriously you take fire prevention. Now let's get into the technical nightmare, because this is where the sheer incompetence becomes undeniable. Germany has a fundamental geography problem. The wind blows strongest in the north along the coast. The factories are in the south, where companies like BMW and Siemens operate. To move power from north to south, you need massive high-voltage transmission lines. The primary one is called Suedlink. It was supposed to be the backbone of the energy transition, ready by 2022 to coincide with the nuclear shutdown. But here's what actually happened. It got buried in bureaucratic quicksand. Endless lawsuits and NIMBY protests forced them to bury the cables underground instead of using overhead lines. This tripled the cost and caused massive delays. The new completion estimate? 2028, maybe. So what happens today when a North Sea storm spins those offshore wind turbines at full capacity? You generate massive amounts of power in the north with no way to deliver it south. The grid becomes dangerously overloaded. To prevent blackouts, grid operators have to order wind farms to shut down. But here's the absurd part, those wind farms still get paid. It's called redispatch compensation. I call it phantom electricity. German consumers are paying wind farms billions not to produce power. In 2022 alone, these congestion management costs hit $4.2 billion. Think about what that means. You're paying for wind energy you never receive. Meanwhile, because that power can't reach southern Germany, the factories in Bavaria have to fire up coal and gas plants to keep operating. You're paying twice, once for green energy that never arrives, and again for the dirty energy you're forced to use instead. It's a monument to dysfunction. And who ultimately pays? The pensioner opening her mailbox to find an electricity bill that's doubled in 3 years. By 2023, the German government recognized that shutting down nuclear while burning coal wasn't exactly achieving their climate goals. They needed a new target. They decided to decarbonize residential heating. Thus was born the Heizungsgesetz, the heating law. Robert Habeck and the Green Party pushed through legislation effectively banning new oil and gas heating systems, starting in 2024. The mandated replacement? Heat pumps. Now, heat pumps are genuinely excellent technology, essentially reverse air conditioners that are highly efficient. But they work best in modern, well-insulated homes with underfloor heating systems. German housing stock? Mostly old, built with thick brick walls, great for durability but terrible for insulation. To make heat pumps work in a typical 1950s German house often requires ripping up floors, replacing radiators, and completely re-insulating walls. The cost anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 per home. The government offered subsidies, but the messaging was catastrophic. It felt like forced expropriation. A retired widow living on a pension in her paid-off home was suddenly told she might need to take out a massive loan just to keep her house warm. The backlash wasn't just angry, it was explosive. The tabloid Bild ran screaming headlines about the Heizhammer, the heating hammer. Habeck's approval ratings collapsed. The far-right AfD party surged in polls by promising to protect people's boilers. The government nearly fell apart. They had to significantly water down the law, adding delays and loopholes. But the damage was done. The heat pump industry, which had scaled up production anticipating huge demand, actually saw sales crash in 2024. Why? Because confused and frightened homeowners panic-bought new gas boilers before the ban took effect, locking in fossil fuel use for another 2 decades. It was a masterclass in policy failure. Instead of incentivizing transition gradually, they tried to mandate it overnight, completely ignoring the economic reality facing ordinary Germans. Now the German government will point out that their emissions are dropping. They met their 2023 climate targets, and technically they're correct. Germany's CO2 emissions in 2023 fell to their lowest level in 70 years. But let's look at why they dropped. Was it because of all those wind turbines? Was it heat pumps? No. It was because factories stopped operating. Energy-intensive industrial production fell by nearly 20%. When you shut down steel mills, chemical plants, and manufacturing facilities, Of course, your emissions decline. Congratulations, you saved the planet by dismantling your economy. This is the equivalent of losing weight by amputating a limb. Yes, the scale shows a lower number, but you're also bleeding out. The head of Germany's Federal Audit Office explicitly stated that Germany is not on a sustainable transition path. They're on a path of economic contraction disguised as climate progress. And it gets even worse when you compare Germany to its neighbor France. France generates 70% of its electricity from nuclear power. Their carbon intensity is around 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Germany, even on good days, hovers around 300-400 grams. So when a German buys an electric vehicle to help the environment, they're charging it with electricity that's 6 to 8 times dirtier than what a French person uses. The supposed green energy leader of Europe is actually one of the continent's biggest polluters, simply because they refuse to accept that nuclear power is zero carbon. Here we are in late 2025. The German economy is stagnating. They were the only major G7 economy to contract in 2023, and growth has been anemic since. The German economic model, cheap energy in, high-quality exports out, is fundamentally broken. The political landscape is fractured. The Green Party is fighting for survival. The industries that built German prosperity are planning exit strategies, and the world is watching and learning. Developing nations like India, Vietnam, and Indonesia are looking at Germany and saying, "We're definitely not doing that." They're building coal plants, they're investing in nuclear. They're prioritizing reliability and affordability over ideology. Germany wanted to be a role model, and they succeeded. They became the perfect example of what not to do. They demonstrated that you cannot run a modern industrial economy on intermittent weather-dependent energy sources alone, not without massive, reliable baseload backup. And if you destroy your clean baseload, nuclear, before your alternatives are ready, you don't transition smoothly. You fall off a cliff. Is there a way forward for Germany? Perhaps. They still have world-class engineers and significant financial resources. There's discussion about restarting some nuclear plants, though the technical and political obstacles are enormous. There's hope that hydrogen technology will eventually provide solutions, but the lesson for everyone else is crystal clear. Energy policy cannot be built on wishful thinking and political posturing. It requires physics, mathematics, and hard-nosed economics. When you let ideology drive the decision-making, don't be shocked when you drive straight off a cliff. Germany spent over $500 billion learning this lesson the hard way. The rest of the world can learn it for free just by watching what happened. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure you're subscribed, because we're going deep on why France is winning the energy game while Germany collapses. It's the perfect contrast to this disaster. Drop a comment and let me know. Should Germany swallow its pride and restart nuclear, or is it already too late? I read every single comment. See you in the next one.